All right, so I am getting this started on YouTube Live here, posting this information on our. You guys will get like an email in just a second. But yeah, we're ready to roll here. So how's everybody doing? Everybody's sleepy. Yeah, it's funny though. I, as I said, I went to Redlands uh, back, gosh, 20 years ago. But this time of year, right, when it's a seminar or semester schedule, right, this is like the end of the term, right? This is like the end of the term. So like I'm feeling like, with this weather, it being like almost, start of April, gosh, it feels like summer is here. So today's gonna be a warm day. So I'm actually kind of happy to be teaching early in the morning, getting the nice weather in before it gets too hot. So um, all right, so I think we got a fun day where a lot of things come together. If you've had, like I said, if you had micro before, this is still going to feel a little bit like a review. But what we're going to do is we're going to really hone in on the gas prices, if not by the end of class today, but definitely by the start of class on Thursday, and talk about why I paid. What did I pay this week? It was like 610 this week on the gas price. So we'll get into that a little bit. And kind of go back to our original question, which is, can we explain fluctuations in the gasoline market using something like a supply and demand model? Then we'll transition into housing, which will be a natural segue into macro econ. Um, when it comes to what you guys have to do for this class, lecture quiz 1 is going to be released on Thursday, so like next class, after next class, like sometime in the afternoon, and it'll be due the following Tuesday. There's only 10 questions on the quiz. And they're going to look a lot like the questions that you're going to get during lecture on Top Hat. So it's really just to kind of keep you guys squared away in terms of how well do you know the material. So I don't want anybody falling behind and saying like, oh, I didn't know I should know this material. You'll see the conversion from lecture to quiz, which will then be kind of converted to an exam then too. We've got discussion activity number 2, which is released now. It's going to be due next Sunday. So I read through more of the discussion activities from number 1, and they really were they're fun to read. I'm reading through all. There's a syllabus quiz on Top Hat that doesn't count for credit. It's just to make you comfortable with the platform. I've read through all those. I was starting to respond to some of those messages, but there's like hundreds of them at this point, so it's hard to stay on top of it. But somebody asked about I think he asked about the price of Dogecoin and whether that was quantity demanded, if that influenced quantity demanded, and I guess to some degree it does. But something like equities or whatnot, they're meant to, something like a stock is, the price of a stock is a little different because that's capturing what people believe the perceived value is in the future. So it's just a little bit different than what we're thinking about with gasoline, but we'll talk about it a little bit as we move through the term. So, any questions or any thoughts before I get rolling for the day? Okay, I'm running from my other class. My other class, I was the dot cam didn't work at 8 in the morning, and then the mirroring stopped working just like it did in this class. So looks like I'm gonna take my dot cam, my little portable dot cam, with me everywhere I go now. So it's gonna be just like my phone. All right, so what did we do last class? All right, let's get rolling. Last class, right? We've got demand. That's what we're essentially looking at. We're looking at how consumers respond to changes in prices. Okay, we're looking at how consumers respond to changes in prices, and so we said if we can take all the combinations of the prices of goods and services and the amount that consumers are willing to buy at those prices, we'll be able to create a demand curve. Now, the amount that folks are willing to buy at these different price levels, we're going to coin that. The term we're going to use is quantity demanded. Okay, so again, quantity demanded demand, that can often be something that can be confused, or just kind of like, wait, what's the difference? I think a clean way to think about this is that quantity demanded is, again, that point on a curve, right? It's a particular amount that's bought at a particular price, or the consumers are willing to buy at a particular price, right? That's different than the demand curve, which is all those combinations. In either sense, though, right, in either case, what we're doing is we're really highlighting consumer behavior. Okay, so all we've thought about so far, I think it's a natural place to start, is if the price of gasoline goes up, what are we going to do? Okay, because we're the ones making those decisions. It's harder to think about what firms do, right? Because we're not sitting there producing gasoline, but we need to think about the other side of the market, because if we want to buy, we can buy as much gasoline as we want, but if that gasoline actually isn't produced, we're not going to be able to buy it. Okay, and so we need to look at the other side of the market, which is going to be the firms, that's going to be the suppliers. Okay, and so the way I want you to think about just the simple gasoline production right now, and it's obviously more complicated than this, but kind of work with me on just the general direction here, is if we're thinking about production of gasoline, right? Just assume that you've got to dig 1 foot into the ground and you'll produce 1 gallon of gasoline, right? So you're somewhere in like LA and you're like near the tar pits or something like that, right? If you dig 1 foot into the ground, you'll get 1 gallon of gasoline. So I remember doing this like as a little kid, like kind of starting to dig up into the ground, right? And after you get about like 6 or 12 inches into the ground and your parents still don't notice that you've done this, you hit like a rock, right? It gets a little bit harder to dig further into the ground, right? But if you dig 2 feet into the ground, imagine you get another gallon of gasoline. And then if you wanted to keep digging, right, and dig like 1,000 feet into the ground, right, you think about how difficult that would become, right? But if you're 1,000 feet down, you're going to produce 1,000 gallons. What I want you to take from this just really kind of simple example is that when you're digging into the ground, or when you're producing more of another additional amount of a good, so in this case gasoline, when you want to go from 1 gallon to 2 gallons, or 2 to 1,000, or 1,000 to 3,000, right, it's going to be more and more difficult and more costly to go get those additional gallons, right? So we would say that there's this increasing cost of production, in the sense that that first gallon is fairly cheap in a relative sense, right? It's relatively cheap to produce, right, compared to that 1,000 gallons that you need to get, right? So we need to think about what would incentivize firms or individuals, right? If you're digging in your yard as a kid, right, and actually finding the oil. If you did that, I guess that seems like a health hazard. At any rate, if that happens, right, if you're digging into the ground, right, and you want to dig further, you need to be incentivized by the price of the good that you're producing, right? So if you think about the gasoline production, if gas is going to stay really, really expensive, right, and people are going to continue to buy it at an expensive price, you're going to see firms wanting to dig further and further into the ground, even though it might be costly in terms of having to go from your hand to a shovel to like a big drill, right, a big capital machine. Okay, so again, just have this story in your mind. This is not something that's like, I'm not going to test you on like how to produce oil or anything like that, or produce gasoline, right? But what we're getting at here is the difference between quantity demanded, right, in that mindset of quantity demanded, and saying, we're going to shift our mindset and think about supply, right? Or we'll say quantity supplied here, okay? And so if we were a firm and we said, okay, the price of gasoline is a certain amount, how much are we going to produce? Well, maybe it's a certain amount that we're willing to put in the effort to dig 1,000 feet into the ground and produce 1,000 gallons. And the amount of production that we're going to have is going to be what we call the quantity supplied. So this is going to be the amount, right, of a product. We'll say that a firm is willing and able to, we'll say, produce at a given price level, right? And so for here, this is actually kind of important to think about this willing and able terminology here, because if you're a firm, right, and you start to drill further and further in the ground, you're going to say the price needs to go up. If I'm drilling this deep, I'm going to charge a higher price. Conversely, if the price starts to go up, you're going to drill deeper, right? So these are kind of what comes first, right? The willing or the able, right? Chicken or the egg, whatever you want to think of it as, right? The firm is looking at the price, they're looking at the cost of production, and they're saying those two things need to meet, right? And as I increase my production, I'm going to produce more, or I'm going to charge a higher price, okay? So how do we convert this into essentially a situation that we're comfortable with, or that's similar to what we had before, right? We need that supply schedule, okay? So if we think about a firm here, right? And we think about a firm, say, drilling for oil. And again, it's funny how perfect these numbers were for like years, right? Like I had these prices kind of starting at, you can see $1 to 350. And even though gas prices were fluctuating over the past like 10 years, it was always kind of within this ballpark. But obviously I need to adjust the numbers. I didn't think I was going to have to so much on the fly. Or hopefully I don't have to. Hopefully like next term it'll be back to something like this. Okay, first thing I want to note though, right? So when the price of gasoline is $1 per gallon, how much are firms supplying? How much are they producing? How much are they willing and able to produce? I've got a zero there. I've got the same thing for $1.50. Can anybody type out why that's the case? Why is that? Why would that be the case? Why is a firm not willing to produce anything at $1 or $1.50? Way too cheap, right? Way too cheap, right? It's not worth it, right? So you're starting to think about like actually getting into the ground. No, yeah, the profit opportunity, labor is exact. This is perfect, right? So if you're going to go down and say like I need to actually go drill, like I said, it was $1, a gallon per foot, right? Is kind of what I had it as. But that's not how it works, right? We've actually got to drill like probably 1,000 feet to start getting any gallons at all. So when the price is $1 or $1.50, we're saying right here, this is not worth it to produce, right? Not worth it to produce. And some of you guys I can tell are coming from micro, right? The revenue doesn't meet their variable cost. Like Dave, what you're thinking about is 100% right. Like, so if you have that in your mind, those things from micro, you're definitely on point with that. You're definitely on point with that. So then what happens at $2, right? And again, work with me on the numbers, right? But at $2, firms are going to say, okay, well, actually, it does make it. It's worth it to go down and at least like crack the surface of where the oil is or where the gasoline is, and we'll produce 4 gallons when it's $2. And then when it's $2.50, right? What's happening? Well, actually, at the price of $2.50, I'm going to actually drill even more. I'll go down to 8. And kind of work the other direction too. Oh, it turns out that I produced 12 gallons of gasoline. That must mean that the price is going to be $3. Okay, but then 3.50 and 16. Notice what's happening though. If you guys remember last class, we were talking about what axes price should go on, whether it should be on the horizontal or the vertical axis. Is it the outcome, right? Is price the outcome, or is price the we'll say independent variable, right? And we've got it down as the outcome, right? But here it kind of feels like that might make a little bit more sense, right? That we're saying like, oh yeah, the price could drive us to increase our quantity supplied, but actually if a firm decides to just go drill down a bunch, we're gonna say, yeah, I'm gonna charge a lot at the same time because it's gotta be worth it for me to produce, right? So they have a little bit more control over that to some degree. So it's a way to justify that price on that horizontal axis or that vertical axis. Okay, I'm going to add one more observation because you guys can imagine we're just going up by 4 then. Okay, so what I want to do here is I want to take all this information, right? All this information and say I don't want to just have a table, right? I'd like to put it onto the same graph that we had that demand curve, and I want to visualize, right? And if this feels redundant, it's meant to be, right? Instead of visualizing the demand schedule, I want to visualize the supply schedule, okay? And so by doing this, I'm going to get a supply curve, and this supply curve is going to give me the combinations, right? The combinations of all prices and QS, right? Quantity supplied, right? Get all of that down on a graph, right? Just see that very broadly, okay? And so how do we do that? Right, again, we're gonna walk through this, right, kind of on the first pass, and that's what we're gonna draw lots of different graphs in this class, right? And again, on every kind of first pass, we're gonna kind of walk through it very slowly, right? But then as time goes on, we'll start to be a little bit more loose about that, okay? About just drawing the graphs. So here, I'm gonna get my numbers right today, right? So let's imagine that a firm produces 4 gallons. If they're going to produce 4 gallons, they're going to make sure that the price is going to be $2, right? Those two things are going to be that's going to be our combination there. Now notice, unlike the demand curve, we don't have this kind of like continue on until we reach some sort of axis. This looks to be our first point right here, right? If the price is below $2, their quantity supplied is 0. So I guess you could go straight to this axis here, but we don't necessarily need to do that. Okay, so we're here at point A, right? We can call that point A, and I'll go ahead and highlight that right there, right? But then if the price of a good goes up, or we could say if the firm decides to produce more, let's say they produce all the way out to 12 right here. Well, what is the price going to be? Well, we can go ahead and look at our supply schedule there, and we've got $3 as the amount that the firm is going to have to charge, or what they're going to charge if they're producing 12 gallons. Conversely, right, if the price goes up to $3, that's how much the firm is going to produce. Okay, so we could have chosen any price quantity combination that exists, right, and we just draw a line through those points, and now we've got our supply curve. Okay, and so this supply curve, right, is really being held together by this law of supply. And in a similar way, the law of demand, right, holds together that demand curve, right? But this relationship that we're drawing here, right, is really exhibiting the law of supply, right? And what is this law of supply saying? This law of supply is saying that as the price of a good goes up, the quantity supplied will also go up, all right? And then it's also saying the other direction, right? If the price goes down, the quantity supplied will also go down, okay? So if we got, like I said, point A, we're at $2 and 4 gallons produced. As that price goes up, we're just going to move along that curve, okay? So my question to you now, right, is what happens, right, and this will be a top hat question, what happens to supply when the price changes? Okay, so when the price changes, right, what's going to happen to supply, and you can think of this as the entire curve, right? And again, if you're thinking like, I kind of feel like this is similar to what we saw last class, right? So in this case, I've got the price going up. What's going to happen to the supply curve? Okay, let's give this a try. Let's start off the day well here. All right, so I'm going to keep this open, right? I'm going to open this back up while I talk about this a little bit, right? But what I want to highlight here is that what I have asked you, right? What happens to supply curve when the price of a good increases, right? We actually see that right on here, right? So we go from, say, $2 to $3. We go from point A to point B, right? So if price rises from $2 to $3, right? We move from A to B, right? We move from point A to point B. So what does this mean about our entire demand curve or supply curve here? It actually means that nothing happens, right? We're essentially deriving the supply curve, but we don't have a new supply curve. We're simply moving along, right? We move along the existing supply curve, right? We move along the existing supply curve. So it turns out that we got a wide distribution here, right, of answers. But those of you who kind of remember maybe back from last week when we were talking about demand, right? When we change the price of these things, the goods and services, we simply just move along these curves. Yeah, so So a couple questions are coming up. This is good here. So wouldn't it depend? So this right here, right? This is just simply saying when the price of gasoline rises, right? So the price of gasoline goes from $2 to $3. We have constructed a curve that is meant, right? That is meant, right, to essentially tell us how much we're going to produce at all these different price levels, right? That's what we did it for. So Christopher brings up the point, but the curve is going up. So the curve is going up. That's exactly right. So when we think about what happens to the entire curve, right? The curve is pointed up, right? But the quantity, right? The quantity supplied is just increasing, right? And that's what's being represented by this curve. So the supply curve being pointed up, right, is different, right, than saying, oh, we're changing the entire curve. Right, so you guys are really, this is great. So keep asking questions if you got them. Right, yeah. So yep, you see it, Cortana. That's great. So Daniel, so the price changes quantity demanded, but it also changes quantity supplied here. Right, those are two different curves. Right, and the changing of that, right, the changing of those quantities will lead us to that equilibrium. Another point. Let me see. I want to make sure I got everything. These are great questions. Both Tiffany and Kiana asked, wait, like, hold on. So if price doesn't change our supply curve, right? Price is not changing our supply curve. We just essentially move along that curve, right? We've got to ask the question, right? What shifts or changes the entire supply curve, right? The entire supply curve. Right, that's the question that you guys are. That's what this leads to, right? So let me bring up on Q&A. So Q&A here. So it's good to think of the alliance supply goes up and down depending on the price of Q of S. So so a question on Q&A. I would think that maybe simplify it, right? Simplify it and just think of supply, right? And that's. No, you're not great on correctness. No. So you're not even great on participation on this, right? But what you're saying, what we're trying to show here, right, is that look, this supply curve. The whole reason that we have the supply curve that exists is that it's telling us this relationship between price and the amount that's produced, or in the case of demand, the price and the amount that's bought, right? But we got the price and the amount that's produced, right? So when the price moves, we're just moving along that curve. But it doesn't mean that the entire supply curve can't shift, right? So let's ground ourselves, right? So now we can just draw a different curve here. We don't have to be so detailed on it with the numbers, right? And just say, okay, so we've got quantity here. Let's draw this out again. And one of the things that might help you is as you're drawing this out, just essentially tell a story and say, okay, so the price is going up, firms are going to produce more, and then at some point, right? This maybe it'll change direction or something like that. But for our purposes, we'll just keep this linear. There's nothing wrong with that. And increasing that price will increase the amount that firms are producing. And as they increase the amount they're producing, they're going to also raise that price, right? It's going to work both directions. So we can put supply 1 on there, right? And let's go ahead and put let's put a dot. Let's say right here. Okay. And at this point, right? The firm is producing Q1, right? And the price that they're going to charge for that is P1, okay? And we'll just call this point A, okay? And so let's see here. Let me see if I want to ask this question yet. Hold up here. Yeah, let's go ahead and ask this. I'm gonna jump ahead just a little bit here because I think why not? Right? Let's ask the question. All right. So price is influencing, right, how much the firm is going to produce. But there's other things that will change, right, how much firms are willing and able to produce, right, other than price. So think about drilling for oil. I think that's probably the easiest way to think about it. So if you're drilling for oil and and there's gasoline down there, right, you convert to gasoline, right, what's going to make you produce more gasoline in a given month? That's not the price, right? There's something other than price, right? So a lot of you guys are thinking about like demand. Like don't put demand on there yet, right? Because demand is kind of that's going to be another element to this, right? I want you to think about just the firm side of things, right? You're saying you're looking at a plot of land. Today I'm going to drill deeper down, right, into the ground, and the reason is because of what, right? Why are you doing that? Okay, so let's get a nice word cloud together. Looking good. That looks right, Dorothy. Yeah.
Trailer for sale or rent. Rooms to let 50 cents. No phone, no pool, no pets. Ain't got no cigarettes. But 2 hours of pushing broom buys a 8 by 12 4-bedroom. I'm a man of means by no means, king of the road. Third boxcar, midnight train, destination Bangor, Maine. Oh, worn out suit and shoes. I don't pay no union dues. I smoke old stogies I have found. Short but not too big around. I'm a man of means by no means, king of the road. I know every engineer on every train.
All right. So this is good. I like seeing, just the conversation during the questions is great too. So David brought up subsidies. I like that. I like that answer. And think about yourself as a firm. If you get subsidized to drill further down to the ground, yeah, that'll certainly play a role in how far you're willing to drill down. Right. So demand, it's not quite demand. Demand's going to move price, which will move quantity supplied. So demand's kind of a bigger picture answer. I know what you're saying, and we'll certainly address that. We're not gonna ignore it, right? But we'll push it off for now. Subsidies sounds good. So like I said, and I was in the chat here, if a firm is getting paid to drill further in the ground, yeah, they'll drill more. Let's see, competition, yes, definitely, whether there is or there isn't. Holidays is more of it's a little bit of a stretch on the supply side, and the reason is because it has to do with really people wanting to go out and buy gasoline. If you're a firm, I guess you would say if the labor is short on holidays, that might play a role. But at any rate, we'll bring holidays into the picture once we put the market together. But technology, absolutely. The cost of the drill, yes, yes, yes. What about energy cost? Right, absolutely. So what about, and so this access that kind of came up on chat right away. I think it was yeah, ease of access to the source. Like maybe there's some easier way to get oil than there was before. And again, technology, the amount of land, the cost of the land that the oil's on. So kind of along those lines, what about like regulations? Speculation is a good one too, and we'll actually bring that up in just a second. Speculation maybe on future prices. So yes, yes, signs of a greater quality of oil further. Yes, yes. So that, yeah, you might think that there's like a better place to go. Regulations are a huge one. That's right, Dave. Yeah. So Dave brought it up in chat there. It might come out here. Um, let's see, anything else here yeah. So yeah, there's the regulations popping up right there. That's great. So let's see, fulfill quota. Yeah, yeah. There might be some sort of external force that's pushing you to do something. Politics. Yeah. So kind of back to regulations, but yeah. Yeah, this is great. These are all good. So hopefully, the reason I like to ask this question is because not because it's, we're going to condense this into categories that are a little bit more tractable, but hopefully you're kind of putting on your supplier hat, right? So it's easy again to think about yourself going out and buying gasoline. That's easy. Do you really think of yourself as like going out and drilling for oil? You don't, but that's what we need to do. We need to get that hat on and start to think about what's going to change, right? And kind of another way to write this is what changes are quantity supplied at all price levels. Okay. What changes, and we'll rewrite this a different way, the amount produced other than price. Okay. So lots of different ways that we can ask this and a lot of great answers up there. So let's condense this here, right? Let's condense this into, again, we don't want to have like 70 different answers up here, right? But we can put them into categories that really kind of capture a lot of what you've answered. So I'm going to start with the biggest shifter, right? The biggest shifter of supply. The biggest shifter of supply is going to be the cost of inputs or the cost of production. So there are a lot of answers that really touched on that. So if you were saying something about like the amount the energy that it takes to drill and things like that, all that stuff is correct. So the cost of inputs, cost of production will be your number one shifter of supply. Okay, and so when we think about it, and for our purposes, we're going to keep the inputs fairly straightforward, fairly simple. When we think about needing to go get gasoline, right, or produce gasoline, there's going to be two major inputs. There's going to be inputs from your workers or your labor, and workers from your capital, or we can think about that as machines. Okay, so you can have people out there like drilling, kind of digging by hand, but that doesn't make any sense, right? You could have drills out there, right? Or you can have machines out there, but if you don't have people, right, it's not going to work, right? So you're going to have to put those two together, right? And that's going to be your input, and that's going to lead to some sort of output, right? So those inputs lead to some sort of output. In this case, we can think of it as gasoline or oil, okay? So when we think about the cost of this, right, when we think about the cost of each of these inputs, the cost of labor, right, how do we define the cost of labor? We're just going to simply say this is wages, right? So the wages of workers, right, will be the cost of labor. So what's going on with the wages of workers? Well, over the past year or so, right, I've been seeing, the same signs that you guys have seen, I think, which is like you can work at a fast food joint for $15, $16 an hour. For me, it's funny because I remember my first job, I was a busser, and they actually like knocked off some tip money, and I was getting paid like $4.25 or something per hour at the time. And then the servers were getting paid like $2 an hour, right? So I'm seeing like, oh man, that's like 60, 70 bucks an hour. That would have been great. So if we think about the firm though, right? If you think about what's going on with the firm, right? Let's go ahead and take a look at what happens. Let's assume that the wages of workers rise, right? So wages start to go up. So something that's happening today. If that's the case, just in our mind, right? If you're running a store, running a business, running a firm, right? And if you want to think of it as something even simpler, like whether it's, it doesn't have to be gasoline, or you think of it as like a fast food joint or like a coffee shop, right? So the wages of your workers rise. Now all of a sudden, this just kind of mentally, you think like this is not necessarily positive for the firm. We're going to see a decrease in supply, right? That's kind of the story that we can tell, right? So the costs of production go up, right? So we can say production costs rise, which means just, again, mentally, we're thinking of this as a decrease in supply, right? So we're going to have less supply than we did before, right? What we're going to translate that to on the screen here is one of two things. Either the firm is going to reduce the amount that they're producing, right? And I'm going to get a better dot here. I'm going to say right here. They're going to reduce the amount they're producing to say like Q low right here, right? And we'll put that dot right there. So we'll call it B right there, right? Or they're going to produce the same amount, but they're going to charge more, right? So we can go ahead and put, say, C right there, right? So either one of those movements are shifting that supply curve to the left. It's decreasing the amount that we're supplying, right? The quantity supplied. So decreasing the quantity supplied at all price levels. So now we've got a new supply curve that goes through those 2 points. We'll go from S1 to S2. And if you didn't hit the dots, just make them big, okay? So we decrease supply, which means we're going to have less quantity supplied at all price levels, at all prices, which means we shift our supply. Don't think of it as up or down because you're going to get backwards on that. We shift supply to the left, right? We shift supply to the left. So this movement right here, right? I think it's easy to think about like the cost of production going up will decrease supply. There's something that's kind of natural about that. So we have a decrease right here, but think of that as a shift to the left. In the same way that demand, when demand decreased, it also shifted to the left. That felt more comfortable with up and down, but again, we don't want to take that and move it to supply because we're going to end up getting backwards, okay? So that's one shift, right? That's one shift that we can have, this decrease in supply because the cost of labor goes up, okay? Another shift we can have, kind of the opposite side of this, right? The other side of this is, let's imagine that the cost of capital decreases, right? The cost of capital decreases. So now, right, this is like cheaper drills, right? Cheaper drills. Well, if that's the case, right, it just intuitively makes sense that production costs have gone down, right? So we're going to see this increase in supply, right? This increase in supply. Yeah, I think a good question came up. I see how it's less QS at all prices because price can just increase, but QS, I don't see how it's less QS at all prices because price can just increase, but QS stays the same. So the thing, okay, so Kenny brings up a good point here. So when Kenny was shifting this to the left here, right, I had said, okay, well, we can think of it as doing this or doing this from that reference point A, right, and we get to B or C. But you could have a reference point way out here at D, right, and that's the same price as C, but now we're just producing less at that price level. Right, so when I think we weren't produced, I didn't set us at way out here at D, right? I set us here at point A and just said, hey, if you're at point A and you have a reduction in supply, that means you're going to have to charge more. But if you were producing way out here at point D, right, you would have produced at the same price level, but you would produce less, and QS would have went down, right? So it's all about your reference point and just kind of what story you'd like to tell, right? But and that's essentially, when we see the supply decrease, it's indicative, and we'll see it with an increase as well, it's indicative of us, yes, decreasing our quantity supplied at all prices, right? But for this particular movement, right, going from over here to over here has a slightly different story, right? Here we're charging more for the same amount. Here we're producing less for the same price, okay? Both of them have the same outcome, though. Okay, and hopefully, actually, if we do this on the increase side, right, hopefully it'll clear things up, because if we have an increase in supply, because now we have production costs going down, what we're going to do, instead of being at point A, we're going to be over here at point D, right here, and say, okay, well, the price is P1, but now it's cheaper to produce, so I'm going to produce Q high right here, and my new supply curve will go through that point, right? My new supply curve will go through that point. Right. Conversely, right, or alternatively rather, we could go down here to point F, just reduce that price, right, but produce the same amount. Okay, so we can go ahead and say these 2 points are part of our new supply 3. Okay, and I'll get to that question in just a second, please. So, all right, so let me make sure this is all looking good. Oh yeah, let me rewrite. This is like kind of important. I should write that nicely. All right, so we'll summarize this in just a second, but there is supply left, okay? If we have an increase in supply, we have more QS at all prices. So what we'll do is we'll shift supply to the right. Okay, we'll shift supply to the right. So Cool. This is great. No, thanks for clearing up my bad handwriting. You should notify me if the handwriting's bad, because I will change it. But then also, you guys filling in and clearing that up for others, it's just that it warms my heart. It actually kind of does. So that's awesome. So okay, so just for completeness here, right? When we see an increase in supply, we're going to shift this to the right. So what I want you guys thinking about here is, when I say, hey, the price of capital, the price of cost of capital has gone down, and you're producing, you're producing coffee. Coffee is a good one, because let's say the cost of coffee beans, right, the coffee beans that you're using to make espressos, the price of that goes down. Well, you'll be willing to produce more at the same price, or you actually don't need to charge as much as you did before, right? But ultimately, both those things, well, that's good for you as a firm or an owner, right? So we're going to increase our supply. How do we show that on the graph right here? We're just going to show that with a shift to the right, okay? So increasing supply, we can tell the story, but then we can attach it to a graph. Again, with the cost of labor, right? If wages go up, we'll say that's going to be harder for firms to produce in terms of cost, right? It's going to be more costly to produce. That seems like a decrease in supply. We'll see that as a shift left. Okay, so have the story, convert it to something that's tangible on the screen. Okay, so the one thing I want to point out real quickly right here, right, is kind of similar to the cost of capital. Technology kind of falls into this. I only think of technology as improving. I think that's fair, right? We don't think of like, oh, hey, technology's making our life hard, like production lower, like worse or more difficult, right? Technology is essentially producing more with the same capital. Okay, so you can think about a drill, right? A drill becomes more efficient. You can drill further or quicker, or whatever you want to think of it as, right? But it's a better drill. Now, all of a sudden, because of technology, right? So now all of a sudden we can produce more. This is going to be an increase in supply. So we'll think of technology as only going one direction. Okay, it's only going one direction. Okay, all right, but that's our big shifter, right? That's our big shifter is the cost of production. I think that's fair. I think it's a nice place to start when it comes to a firm, because again, we're not accustomed to like running businesses that often. It's a lot easier to think of ourselves as consumers. Okay, however, right, there's lots of other things that can shift our supply curve, right? So what else, right? What else shifts supply, right? So the cost of production is one, right? That's the big one, right? But then you guys got all these other answers down here, right? So I've got a couple of them listed out, so let's take a look at them, right? Here we go, right? Here's an example, right? I think it's always kind of fun to just have an example in our mind, right? To give us some grounding. But let's imagine, right? Let's imagine, right? You own, right? You own, so we'll say a piece of land, right? A piece of land, okay? So this land has oil, right? So the land, right? The land has oil and, right? And can be used, right? As a, we'll say, national park, right? As a national park. So land's got oil, right? You can drill for oil, but you can also use it as a national park. And I like this example because, again, you're not necessarily going to be drilling in a national, you can't drill in a national park, but also that would make kind of like the enjoyment of it. You're trying to get away from things and it's like, oh, there's a big oil drill here, right? So we can think about if you're owning this land, right? We'll put some landowners, right? Some landowners will stop drilling, right? And they're going to say, there's an alternative use, right, of this resource, right? And because there's this alternative use, it may be more beneficial for me, whether it's financial or just in terms of wanting to protect the environment, however you want to, whatever story you want to tell, right? Some of these landowners will stop drilling. And so what does that convert to, right? How can we show that? Well, that's ultimately saying that we're going to have fewer, right? We'll say oil drillers, less production, right? Does this matter? Does the price of the gasoline matter? I suppose it does matter on some margin, but ultimately, right? If you're sitting there saying like, okay, I'm drilling for oil, and somebody says, actually, you could turn this into a national park, and this is the kind of revenue you get from this, right? Well, all of a sudden you've got less. Some people on the margin will say, yeah, I'm going to go ahead and stop producing oil. I'm going to stop producing gasoline. We are going to shift our supply left. The reason is because, again, the story we're telling with less production is a decrease, right? A decrease in supply. Right? Decrease in supply, right? Both those things are, again, they're the same thing. Okay. So, all right. So that's another shifter, right? That's just another shifter. So let's see, do I want to, no, I don't want to draw anything quite yet. Okay, so what else is there? Well, we had technology, number of producers. You guys had let me go back to the answers that you guys had, right? Because again, the subsidies was another one, right? So subsidies and taxes. So I'm going to bring this up here. Start question. Let me get that word cloud back. You guys don't need to answer this. This is not. I'm not going to do anything with regards to answering here. Close and bear with me here. And word cloud. Where are you? Responses. There we go. All right, so what else do you guys have, right? We can write these down, right? Other shifters, right? We can have the number of producers, right? That's one, right? And let me just move that a little bit for us here, right there. All right, number of producers. We had technology already. We've got, like I said, let's put the subsidies on there. What's a subsidy? Right, again, a subsidy is essentially paying people to drill more, right? So what is this going to do? A subsidy will shift supply to the right, okay? What about a tax, right? What if we don't like this oil drilling and we put this tax, we impose this tax on firms, right? This will shift supply left, okay? We've got regulations on there. We've got excess, and regulation go either direction. What about weather? You know, this has some element to the gasoline production process, but actually like agriculture, right? Agriculture is directly based on weather. But you could also think about transportation or transporting goods and services when weather is bad, right? That makes it harder to transport. So poor weather, right? This is going to be a decrease in supply, right? There can be geopolitical events, right? Geopolitical events. We talk about supply chain, right? We've already mentioned that, but supply chain issues, right, or just supply chain in general. If the supply chain has an issue, and by that we mean at some point along the movement from oil to gasoline, there's some hiccup in the process, right? So the transportation's shut down, or when COVID was happening, right, we ultimately had things like ports were having trouble moving materials, right? That's exactly what we saw. We saw supply chain issues. We saw a decrease in supply as a result. A couple of questions came up. Can producers just shift the tax onto consumers? And since oil and gas has an inelastic, consumers suffer more. So David, you're 100% right. You're kind of like the way you would think about this, though, right, is that the burden of the tax, right? So if the tax leads to a decrease in supply, right? So a decrease in supply, right? The supply curve will shift, but when it comes to the amount of production, we need the demand curve in there to figure out essentially who bears the burden of that tax. So it's one thing to impose a tax on the producers, right? And it's another thing as to how that increase in the tax is going to turn into a higher price or not, or kind of how much of that tax is going to be placed on the consumer. So it doesn't actually matter, at least theoretically, matter who gets the tax, whether it's a producer or a consumer. What matters, and what you've mentioned, is the shape of the demand and the supply curve, the relative elasticity, which is a really interesting micro concept. So we're not going to get quite into it, but it's certainly going on in the background, right? So, all right, and so then the other question, right? This is great. I love these questions. So Haley asked, just checking, just decrease in supply is the same thing as shifting supply to the left, right? So decrease left, increase right. So you got it. Okay. Okay. So another thing, and I want you, again, this is to put ourselves into the mind of a producer. I want you guys to think about what's going to happen, right, if there's some sort of change in the expectation for future prices. Okay. And so I actually am going to ask a question on this, like we have today. So this would have been, you gotta think about where the market could be headed. But gasoline companies in this example were saying they believe that next year the price of gas will be higher than it is today. It's hard to imagine that, right? But let's imagine that we've got a lot of information, maybe about where oil is being produced and how that's affecting the entire market. for gasoline, right? But let's go ahead and have the scenario be that producers, right, producers expect prices of anything, but in this case of gasoline, to increase, and I'm going to put in bold, next year. Okay. What happens to, well, we'll say supply, we'll say, what happens today? How's that? What happens today? And I'll underline that, okay? So let's give this a try, right? Let's give this a try, and let's see how we're feeling about each of these different statements, okay? So, all right, here we go. All right. So, okay. So, how are we going to deal with this? What's the most correct answer here? So we've got producers, all right, and they think, and gasoline companies, right? And so what they're doing is they're thinking, okay, so next year the price is going to be higher. So when should I produce, right? I think that's maybe another way that we can ask this question, right? Should I produce more now or should I produce more later? Well, if next year you do think that the prices are going to go up, well, it seems like you should reduce the amount of production today, right? So we want to reduce the amount of production today, okay? So when we say we want to reduce the amount of production, I think what pops up, and we can see it, yeah, so it's not surprising, right? We see there's this split here essentially between a decrease in the quantity supplied and a decrease in the supply, okay? This is really challenging just how you're feeling about quantity supplied versus the entire supply curve. So we're going to reduce the amount of production today. However, so we decrease our quantity supplied, but the price today does not change. So if the price today is not changing, but our quantity supplied is changing, this implies that we have an entire change, right? Our entire supply curve changes. And in particular, it decreases. So those of you who said there's a decrease in quantity supplied, right? You're not incorrect in the sense that there is a decrease in quantity supplied. But when we're thinking about saying what exactly happens when we expect this increase in prices in the future, the most accurate statement is that, hey,